and check that things are all working, and then we'll go ahead and get started for the day. I need to embarrassingly change some of the information while showing you my screen, so I'm going to do that now. Yeah, keep forgetting to change this before class starts. So, not the best Twitch streamer, not the most professional Twitch streamer out there, but that's okay. Hopefully this loads. Okay, lecture 7, layout and plugins. Awesome. Hopefully that updates for the stream, and we can go ahead and get started now. Okay. All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming today. Congrats on finishing up your midterms. If you're not done yet, that's also okay. Congrats on finishing it soon. We are really very excited to see them. I personally am going to look at all of them just for fun, but we'll probably not be grading them. But super stoked to see those. Thank you for coming today. We're going to be talking about auto layout and plugins. We mentioned plugins a little bit last week, but there's a lot more that we have to share about them. And auto layout is a pretty hefty topic, so we really want to make sure that people understand it. The lab and the homework this week are super in-depth in a way that's going to help you practice things, get the skills under your fingers, and just get used to how to use auto layout. But before that, does anybody have any kind of miscellaneous questions about the midterm or about extensions before we jump into today? Okay, no worries. If you have requested an extension and we haven't gotten back to you, we will be responding to you by tonight. Basically, don't worry. We want to make sure that people are able to spend genuine time on the midterm. We don't want to make it the most stressful class you have by any means. So please do let us know if you need anything last minute. If you haven't been responded to, we'll respond tonight, or you can feel free to ping us again just in case it slipped our mind. But yeah, today we're going to be talking about auto layout, and then a couple of really interesting principles, specifically content-driven design and plain language, which are ways to basically use text and communication and language to really empower your designs and make them better. Then we're going to talk about Figma plugins and then wrap up for the day. So the attendance form today is yelkey.com/worker. That should show you the lecture 7 attendance form. Again, this is for students only. And this link should be up for about 5 or so more hours, so until the end of the night. That again is yelkey.com/worker. Right, got that pulled up. We'll go ahead and start with auto layout. So auto layout describes dynamic frames that respond to content. So the way that we've been designing things so far, a lot of it is pretty static. You've seen that if you resize the page, a lot of the time, it won't really react the way that you want it to. But by adding auto layout as a property to your current designs, you can create really dynamic frames that respond to the kind of content that you put on them. So basically this means that the designs that you create can grow, they can shrink, they can fill up, match the kind of content of the box that they're held inside, which is really helpful if you need to do things like accommodate longer text things, when you really want a button component that isn't static in size across every single button, or if you want to maintain the alignment or organization of different designs as they move across different size screens. So you've seen that a lot of the time you'll be designing for one phone, like you'll design for the iPhone 11, but that's going to be really different, especially if you go to older models of phones with significantly smaller screens. So auto layout is a really great way to make things that are responsive and really realistic. So what can you actually do with this term auto layout? So one thing you can do is create buttons that resize automatically as the text changes. So you see here, if you had a fixed width button, when you type text, it'll just kind of exit out of the screen. But if you have an auto layout button, it can expand naturally, so you don't have to do all of the formatting a second time, so that everything applies to it naturally. You can also make menus and lists that you can reorder really quickly. This might be familiar to you with Smart Select. So anytime that you've ever had to select a bunch of objects and rearrange them really quickly, you can do that with Smart Select, but Auto Layout lets you do it really automatically as well, because you have all these items that are really neatly organized that you can swap really easily, and Figma will know how to rearrange them. You can also create responsive components, this is kind of what we've mentioned, and make full screens that work across multiple device types. So you can think about stuff like, if I were to resize my screen to be a lot smaller, is it still going to be able to show the information that I need? Like you see that this preview is shrinking as I shrink my screen, and it's growing as I grow my screen. It's not cutting it off because I wouldn't want it to cut off and be not visible to me anymore. So you can add auto layout to any frame or selection of objects. If you add it to a selection of objects, it's automatically going to encompass them inside of another frame. So we talked briefly about nesting frames and kind of why you might ever need to nest them. Auto layout is a really prime example of a case that you're going to be nesting frames a lot. I want you to make that not a scary thing to do. Auto layout requires a lot of nesting because of some of the constraints that go with it. So don't be afraid to put stuff inside of each other. It's not going to ruin anything. It's not going to mess it up. Worst case scenario, you can always take it back out. So just get comfortable with the idea of nesting frames inside of each other. So if you want to add auto layout as a property to a selected frame, like say you have a list of objects that are already like pieces of text that you want to be like equidistant apart, you can add auto layout to those pieces of text by either clicking the plus button on the right sidebar, which you're going to be able to see if I, for example, select a bunch of these objects. Oh, that's not going to work. I select maybe these three. You're going to see that this auto layout item is like grayed out. You see this sometimes you have like a grayed out option that you can add. So auto layout is one of those. And I can click on it, or I can press Shift A on my keyboard, or I can right click and select add auto layout right here. So those are the three ways to add auto layout. So what actually happens when you do that? What are the actual auto layout properties? The first, kind of the most straightforward one, I guess, is direction. So direction describes the direction, I guess, or the way that the auto layout components are going to be ordered. You can either have it go vertically or horizontally. It's not going to be able to do both, which is why you're going to have so much of that nesting going on, where if you need it to do both, you're going to have to put them inside of each other. But if you have a horizontally organized auto layout, you'll see you can do this. So here we have these two cards that have the time. When you add another piece to the auto layout, it'll automatically put them in equally spaced, distant from each other, horizontally. The same idea happens vertically, where in this card, it might be hard to tell, but we have this like top piece of text that says Brutalism Tour $50, and then explore the city's brutalist architecture. And then those two things are vertically organized. They're kind of one on top, one beneath it, one beneath it, one beneath it. We can add that inserted card auto layout frame to be beneath that as well. So we're going to learn how to kind of break down a card or break down a piece of UI to understand how it's laid out and how you can best start to recreate it. The direction, again, it can only be vertical or horizontal. It can't be both, and it must be one of them. Spacing, pretty straightforward as well. If you've ever used Smart Select or just manually space things out on your own, it's the distance, number of pixels between two particular items inside of an auto layout frame. So in this case, I've got a row of items. That's the whole frame that contains 4 cards as a item. And I can adjust the horizontal space between them through this kind of piece of UI that shows up in the menu. It's got these icons, and a nice thing about auto layout is that there are a lot of icons, but they do a pretty good job of explaining what they are. So with these two, you have the sense of like 2 cards and the space between them. With this one, you have 2 cards like this, with the space between them as well highlighted. And you can adjust these like you would adjust any other value inside of your sidebar. Next is padding. So padding controls the amount of empty space that there is between the child object and the boundary of the auto layout frame. This is a little bit more confusing, but it becomes easier to visualize once you actually practice it. So with this particular button, for example, you can adjust the space between the button and the edge of the button with like the white space in between. Here you can have it be mixed, so if you wanted the top to be 10 and the sides to be 20, you can do that. You can manually change all of those things the way that you can do it with border radius as well, or you can have them all be the same equal value. But yeah, this idea of padding is just the space between an object in its container, or kind of just the amount of breathing room that something has. Another important thing is alignment. This is something that they have a really handy visual tool to help you understand what it does. But it basically describes how children are arranged within a particular frame. So this interactive grid kind of shows you best how it's actually working. We're going to be able to play with that a little bit later. But you see that here there's these 3 items that can be placed in the middle, in the left, on the bottom middle, the top right, the middle again. They can be set to packed or space between, where packed is going to put all of the objects really close together based on the spacing that you prescribe. So you say, hey, I want 3 objects, I want them all to be 20 pixels apart, that's packed. If you say then you want 3 objects spaced evenly, you can change it to space between. So you're going to push them to the edges and calculate how much space it wants in the middle. So that would be helpful for something like if you had a couple of buttons on the screen that you wanted to manually resize between any phone screens so that they all span across the bottom, like a navigation bar, for example. But you might want that space between if it's or the packed option where they're close to each other, if it's something like the top navigation part of a menu or a website, and you want them to be equally distant. The distribution shows you how objects are going to be spread or packed within an auto layout frame. This is what I was just talking about. I didn't realize there's a whole slide for it. But basically, you see how packed items are going to function. And something to note is that in this example, the title Figma and this whole nav bar, I believe, are each one object. So you see that the spacing within the nav bar itself, this whole half, stays pretty consistent and doesn't change at all. So imagine that this whole navigation section is one object, and then the logo is one object. So these 2 objects are going to be either packed or have the space between them. You're going to see how that changes with this bar. And in this case, this is somewhere you might want the space between to have the left aligned title and the right aligned navigation bar. Now, resizing is something that's a really critical part of auto layout. It's something that is not really encapsulated by any of the other tools. So a lot of the other tools can manually give you things like spacing. They can manually do things like constraints. But this idea of resizing is really unique to auto layout. So resizing determines how the parent auto layout frames adapt to changes in their child objects. And just to clarify, this idea of like parent and child is something nested inside of a bigger frame. So in this case, the parent is this whole kind of square rectangular frame, and the child is the stuff that's inside of it, specifically this nav bar. So with resizing, there's a couple of different options. First is fixed width or height, where the dimensions are going to remain the same, no matter what kind of content is inside of them. The second is hug content, and then that's different from fill container. So hug content means that the frame itself is going to hug and keep really tight against the objects inside of it, whereas fill container means that the objects are going to stretch out to fit whatever their parent frame is. These are really hard for me to like verbally describe, so we're going to be playing with it in a demo in just a moment, and then getting a lot of practice with it in the lab and homework this week. So again, I mentioned how you can nest auto layout. This concept of nesting makes auto layout a lot more flexible. You're going to have a pretty limited range of what you can do with just one auto layout frame. So if you're building something, it is a really good practice to consistently apply auto layout where it's useful and to keep things nested within each other. And then you can navigate or manipulate all of those kind of independently as well. So when you nest an auto layout frame, the nested frame will have both parent and child properties. This is something that's also hard to visualize. You have to kind of play with it on your own, but you can nest in a few ways. So first, you can drag an auto layout frame into an existing auto layout frame like you see here. It shows you this kind of blue line to tell you like, hey, once you let go, it's going to be put in right here. So drag, and you can see that blue line, When you let go, it's going to place it in there. You can also create a new auto layout frame around a selection of existing frames. So just doing that Shift A or that Add Auto Layout whenever you have other things selected. So here's an example of kind of breaking down when you look at a set of objects, how you might approach the auto layout for it. And this actually really, really closely parallels the demo that we're about to do. So in this case, we can look at the smallest component first, like the most detailed bit of it, and then work our way up. So we look at the most child and go from the child to its parent, to its parent, to its parent, to its parent. You can also do it the other way around, but we're going to go ahead and do it this way. So in this case, the first item here is a button. A button is a really classic example of how cleanly auto layout can work. So a button is literally just a single piece of text with an auto layout frame wrapped around it so it can resize easily. So we have one button, and we're going to have a whole row of buttons. So in this case, there's two. You see them right here. We combine those buttons into a second auto layout frame that is a horizontally laid out frame so that the buttons are left to right next to each other. After that, we have the whole contents of the post, which is organized, as you can see here, an author. The author is composed of a circular avatar and a title. After the author comes this image. After the image comes this text. And then after the text comes this button row. So we're starting to understand this whole post as a series of other objects or other kinds of frames that you can put one on top of the other. So this kind of top to bottom hierarchy you have going on there. And then if we want to make this into something like a news feed, we can then add two posts to a vertical auto layout feed to create the sense of like stacked objects. Any questions about any of this so far? Any questions in the chat? Okay, awesome. Then in that case, we're going to go ahead and actually do this demo. So if you haven't already, please do duplicate the lecture file to follow along. You can find it at figma.com/@figmadecal. And we'll be going through this demo together, which is on the second page. And it is actually what we literally just talked about. So we're going to go backwards through that process and figure out how exactly to make this post the way that it looks right now. Give everyone just a second to pull that up. Something that you might also notice, if you haven't already, so there's a huge Figma launch today of like a lot of different new features, including big updates to community and also huge updates to FigJam. So the lecture that we taught last week is a little bit obsolete now, but that's okay because we'll fix it for next year. But it's a lot of really cool stuff to explore, and if we have some extra time at the end of this lecture, which I think we will, I might try to show a couple of the new features. But yeah, if you're here, we can go ahead and start this. So just to break this down, something to note is that this should be locked, which means that you can't really dive into it. I've unlocked it here. Don't unlock it, leave it locked for now. And then we're also going to be able to see like kind of what the quote unquote right answer was, or how Annie had actually made this when she made it originally. But we'll go ahead and get started. So we see here a starter kit with some basic pieces of text, so we don't have to worry about the formatting or anything like that. And then this workspace. So like we said earlier, let's go from the smallest piece and then work our way up. The first thing we're going to do is make that button. So I'm going to pull this piece of text that says like. You can see it's just a piece of text. There's nothing else attached to it. And then I'm going to add auto layout to it. I'm actually going to do this by pressing Shift A. So once I press Shift A, you don't really see anything got added, but you can tell that in the workspace, there's now a frame 1 with the text like inside of it. So because I have this, I want to make it have this visible stroke. So I'm going to go down here and add a stroke of, let's say, like 3. And now I can kind of see this box that bounds the like. So originally it was just a piece of text, but now it's a piece of text with a box around it. And you can see here that the padding is 10. So if I wanted to do a bigger amount of padding, I can go ahead and add it to be 20. You see that doubles in size. You can see a lot more information there. And then I actually want to mimic what's going on in the example, where the left and the right side have a lot more padding than the top and the bottom. So if I want to do that, there's two things I can do. I can either press 20 and then comma 40. The Figma is going to be smart enough to know that you mean like 20, 40, 20, 40. Figma is going to be reading the padding as top, right, left, top, right, bottom, left. If you ever want to remember that, or you can just go ahead and click into this more interactive piece that's a little bit more visual and click 20, 40, 20, 40. You're going to see a lot of the other features here that we didn't really discuss, and you're going to be able to change them. But in this case, you don't see anything change because it's just one element. It's just a single piece of text inside of this padded box, so it's not really going to change. For good measure, you can put it in the middle so that it acts the way you want it to in case something ever goes wrong. Yeah, now I've got one button, and we see in this example there are 3 buttons. So I'm going to go ahead and make 2 copies of it by holding Alt and dragging out. And make this one say comment. You can see the magic here where it changes the length of the box as I change the piece of text to be exactly what I need it to be. Is anybody not seeing that on their screen right now when they try to do it? Is anybody like having it not resize? Please just feel free to shoot your hand up if you have anything going on. I'm happy to come take a look. I know this can be pretty tricky as we keep going. So I'm gonna make the next one. I'm gonna have it say share. And now I've got these 3 identical buttons. All of these are their own auto layout frame. And you can tell it's auto layout based on the icon. Auto layout uses 2 different icons. One is these 2 skinny rectangles to the left and right. The other one is gonna be 2 skinny rectangles top and bottom. Those are gonna convey to you whether it's horizontal or vertical. So with this, I'm gonna select all 3 of these. And then I'm gonna go ahead and add another layer of auto layout. So when I click this, you see that it's collapsed them into a frame 4. Frame 4 contains frames 1, 2, and 3. And then you see here that I've had a 39 space between. Yours might be different depending on how far you drag them out. But that's what it's going to say right now. Something interesting about the example is actually that they should be resizable. So I'm going to go ahead and unfreeze this so I can show you what it looks like when you resize it. If I select it, if I pull it to be wider, oh, just kidding. If I select this one, if I pull it to be wider, the buttons are actually going to resize as well. And this is how we talked about earlier, this idea of space between versus packed. This is a case where I want it to be space between because I want the like to always be on the left, the share to always be on the right, and the comment to always be in the middle. So when I do that, I'm going to go ahead and select these, go here, and then change it from packed to being space between. And again, nothing is really going to show up or be different right now because it's not contained within another parent. But once it is later, you're going to be able to see how that works. And I'll set some of them to not show that so that we can understand how that better functions. All right, so that is this button row. That was kind of the first component we talked about. Let's go ahead and make the rest of this. So now let's work our way from bottom to top. We've got this button row, and then we've got a photograph. So I'm going to pull this photograph in here and just put it right there. And these are not the same width right now, but we're going to be able to correct that in just a bit. I'll then pull the text to be on top of it. And then finally, I want that kind of author piece that has a profile picture and a piece of text. So I grab these items. I grab the profile picture first. I make it left aligned, and then I grab the name. I want the name to be aligned with the center of the photo. So I'm going to drag it to be right here. And then I don't think we actually have to do this, but we could apply another piece of auto layout to it. You don't really need to, so I'm not going to do it for now. But I want these to be 24 pixels apart. One thing is that even if I don't have them treated as 2 separate auto layout frames, I do want it to treat it like one object. So if we look at this, you see here that there's basically 4 rows. The top is the author, the next is the text, the next is the photo, and the next is the button row. For this to be treated as one object, I would need to either put them inside of their own frame or put them inside of their own group. So I'm going to group them because otherwise what's going to happen is they're going to become 2 lines. So I'm going to actually just show you what that might look like. I'm going to select everything here, the photo, the name, the text, the image, the bar of buttons, and then add auto layout. And when I do that, you see that it's moved the name to be underneath the avatar because it's treating them all as different items. So I'm going to undo that, group it, and then add auto layout one more time. And when I do that, you see that it's treating it now as a single row, as a single object instead of as 2. So grouping is always going to make things be treated as a single object. Yeah, now I've got this series of items that's still not quite spaced the way I necessarily want it to. And you're going to see that when I resize this, it's not going to bring anything to be wider the way that I wanted to before. So I'm going to have to fix that as well. Okay, let me see this. I'm going to add a little bit of padding to the edge. I'm going to add a stroke. So we can see kind of the edge of the frame, and then add a little bit of padding so I know what that looks like. That might be a mistake. We will see in just a minute. But here, you can see this resizing property we talked about before. I want these to, instead of being fixed with, say, fill container, and when I have them fill the container, it's going to like pull it all the way out and match the edges of the parent that it's inside of, which is this whole post. If I instead had it say hug contents, it's going to pull it back into being packed instead of being space between. So I want it to be fill container. And you see here that it's done a little bit of a janky thing here. So when we had this before, and we went into the sizing, we set into space between, which means it's going to react the way we want it to. But if we have it be packed, and then we also set this to be fill container, it won't react the way you want it to because it's still packed inside of the filled container. So in this case, it's pulled the whole frame out all the way, but it's got this empty space because it's not set to fill space between. So we're going to go ahead and set it to space between, and that's going to fix that. Again, this is a lot of jargon and a lot of words. The reality is that a lot of the time with auto layout, you're going to have to just fiddle with it until it feels comfortable to you. But just keep in mind that there's a couple of submenus that you need to look at. So if something is not reacting the way that you think it should be, don't forget to check this specific alignment and padding icon, because a lot of the answers to your issues might live in here. Make sure to check that out. But yeah, that is looking good. So now if I resize this, you see that the buttons are coming with me. Let's make everything now do the same thing of filling the container. So this picture, I want it to fill the container as well. This text, I want it to fill container as well. And now you see that everything is going to resize the way you want it to. So now because everything has been set to being fill container, it's going to do just that. It's going to fill the container up to be whatever width it is set to at the time. So now we've got a single post. And if we want to have this feed, we want to have two posts that are on top of each other. So I'm going to grab this and make a copy of it. Let's actually just drag it out so that there's a little bit more room. I'm going to make a copy. I'm not going to put in different filler text right now, but with these two frames, I'm going to go ahead and select them both and add another layer of auto layout to them. And now what I can basically do is add a lot more and then keep putting them in like a different order. So with this, I can grab this post and drag it up to be above it. It's kind of hard to tell because the images are the same. Let's go ahead and make this just like a color so it's easier to tell. Let's make another one to put inside. You see here, I just copy pasted. And when you do that, it's going to automatically insert below, which is really handy. So I can do that, change this to a different color. And now this whole frame 7, we're going to go back and rename these so they make sense. You can see that I can move items from inside of it. So I can pull this to be underneath. It's going to move where I want it to be. It's going to look really nice. And then if I want to make frame 7 wider, you're going to see that that's actually not going to change the contents. But if I change frame 7, I believe, to have the width say, or maybe not actually. That might actually be a limitation here. But let me see this. Yeah, so a limitation is like that whole kind of stack of posts isn't necessarily going to resize the way I want it to. But if I took an individual post, I can still do that manipulation that we talked about earlier, making it wider, making it narrower. It's going to react the way I want it to. So if we were then, say, for example, to make these different components, or all the same component, when I resize one of them, it's going to resize all of them. So I'm going to go ahead and make this a component. I'm going to delete this. And then instead add 3 more components. So 1, 2, 3, make these auto layout. Whenever I resize this one, it should resize dynamically here. So you see that with the component property, changing the main auto layout frame will change all of the further child instances of auto layout as well. So that is basically the demo. Are there any questions about any of this? Okay, that's totally fine. Auto layout, I'm gonna say, was one of the hardest things for me to learn. I am still like a little bit struggling all the time with exactly how to do it how to make it do exactly what I want it to do all the time. It does require a little bit of fiddling for me personally as well. It's definitely not one of my strongest Figma tools. And with that, I want to remind everyone that you don't have to be perfect at every single tool we learn. We've covered already a lot of pretty complicated topics, like the pen tool, like prototyping, like variants. They're not like always the easiest thing to pick up. Like I think everyone in this class has been picking things up remarkably quickly. The way that everyone blasts kind of through these labs and these homeworks and shows really good work is really like amazing to see. So if this ends up being the tool like it is for me, that is kind of the hardest thing for you so far, that's totally fine. Please do the lab this week. It is a really awesome lab and you put a lot of time into it. It's called Auto Layout Flexbox Froggy. And it basically goes through a ton of tiny little games or like puzzles for you to practice auto layout and visualize what it's going to look like. And the homework this week as well is really practical, where you're making a menu, like a restaurant menu of some kind, and seeing how you might apply auto layout in the real world. So take your time on those. Please come to office hours if you ever need anything. I'm going to say that forever and ever. And let us know if you have any questions about this. But yeah, just a really quick glance into this lab. Very well put together. It has all of these little games for you to practice how to do different facets of auto layout. Your TA is going to walk you through this, but this is one week that we would highly recommend that you do the lab before you start the homework. So if you were even like if you normally do like the homework on Wednesdays or something, we'd require or really encourage you to get comfortable with the lab first. But yeah, until then, we're going to take a little bit of a break until 7:45 and then jump into the second half of lecture. Okay. We're back. Okay. So the second half of lecture today is going to be about a couple of different things when you kind of ease your way back in. As a heads up, if you remember from last week, all the projectors turned off at 8:20, and I didn't email them. So we're gonna try to finish by 8:20 today, and then I will email them this week. But yeah, I'm just gonna expect that will happen tonight. So let's go ahead and get through the rest of today. I don't think it should be too long. So, content-driven design, the subheader that Annie wrote for this was death to lorem ipsum, and for good reason. So what exactly is content-driven design? This term focuses basically on using actual content throughout the design process to inform and to guide your decisions. So when we say content, that means a lot of different things, from media, like photos, videos, charts, tables, text, all of that good stuff. And the point of doing this is that when you're designing something, it's always critical to know why you're designing it, what the purpose of it is, and how you're going to be achieving that purpose before you even start kind of putting in that real content. So having content that is as close to real as possible is going to help you better make decisions that are going to be most beneficial to your end users and to the design itself. Yeah. So design should always mold the content that it contains, not the other way around. So a lot of the time you're going to see like lorem ipsum. Have y'all heard of like lorem ipsum before? It's basically a set of filler text. I want to say it's nonsense or Latin. I think it's nonsense though. It goes like lorem ipsum, docet, dolet, or whatever. And it's extremely long pieces of text that are there so you can copy paste them to look like you have real text when you really don't. But an issue with this is that because it's all gibberish, you can make it as short or as long as you want it to and have it feel good. The reality is that if you were doing this kind of listing that has all of these coaches, people are not actually going to all write nice 3-line descriptions. There's going to be people who write a sentence. There's going to be people who write an essay. And because you've clipped all of the lorem ipsum to look the way that you want it to, you're only going to see a version of your design that feels really good. You're not going to be able to stress test it. You're not going to be able to see what it's actually going to look like when you start using it until it's too late. So basing designs on the content instead of basically handling edge cases as you get later and later in the process means that you're going to be able to make things more inclusive as you go. So if I were to do this and then I was at this hi-fi stage, you see it's already like really well polished. It's already at hi-fi. It's probably already close to being handed off. And then I start finding users and learning that they're writing descriptions that are all 20 sentences long. I'm in trouble because they are not going to be fitting in the space that I have created. People are not going to be able to scan them and learn the information that I wanted them to learn. If I had talked to them first and learned about how long their pieces of text were going to be, then I have a better chance of making each of these cards look more appropriate. And also, this is not to like shit on this person's design in particular or anything. You're going to see a lot of stuff that looks like this on Dribbble, especially, where people have basically really cleanly laid out designs, when the reality is that a lot of the time when you're doing actual design work, when you're actually using something, it doesn't always look perfect. So this is not the fault of this particular designer, but rather the fault of this habit that designers have been taught to do over and over again. So again, prioritizing considerations early in the design process leads you to avoiding having to handle tons of edge cases at the end. So here's another bad example, probably from Dribbble, of a kind of dashboard of some kind. So one thing to note immediately is I have no idea what this dashboard is for. Like based on looking at this, because all the content is fake, I have no clue what it is for. You know, some kind of statistical things. Once I read into a little bit of the text, it seems to say like total posts, average views, but that wasn't clear to me immediately. Another thing is that in this example, the design for these like story icons at the top only account for pretty short Anglo-Saxon or white names like James, Mark, Christian. You have this issue of how longer names might be handled. That's actually something that I ran into when I was designing the template for the trading card. I realized I was using the names of only our decal staff, which are all relatively short, and there wasn't really a case for really long names. So that is one issue off the top of our heads that this dashboard has in particular. Another is that these graphs and charts that they have on the side here, these like this analytics chart and this countries chart, don't have real data on them. They look really nice because the colors are distributed really prettily, but most charts are not going to look that good. And I'm not actually sure what kind of information should be there when I actually implement this dashboard into my app. I don't know if this country's chart is going to be helpful to me at all. If I have all users in the United States, it's going to be all just like a ring of purple all the time. That's not going to be helpful to me. And finally, another example is these placeholder gradient images. Again, they look so nice. These are really beautiful gradients. They've done a really great job making them. But if they were actually users, these images are not going to have, like, for example, the colors that I want them to. They're not going to be users who are always posting purple and orange and green and pastels. And so I won't know how this dashboard looks in practice. Another thing is that if these are icons that they're overlaying on top of the image, it might not be accessible if they have, for example, a black background with this dark icon on top of it. It's not going to be readable at all. You're not sure what's going to be going on there. So all of the content that's on this page basically does not help. It doesn't really tell you at all what this dashboard is for. It doesn't tell you how the app is going to actually function. And the pieces of it that do tell you information are the pieces where they have the real text that will end up there. So like in this menu here, you have dashboard, reports, invoices, customers. All of those things with real icons and real text do inform us about what the dashboard is going towards, but a lot of it is not necessarily helpful. So another thing to note is that good content-driven design doesn't always mean just having real content. It means also having varied content. So specifically this piece about names shows up a lot. You're going to have a lot of situations where stock photos are very white. Stock photos lean very male. There are a lot of, I think, good resources that help you find more varied content, more diverse content with different name lengths, different kind of addresses, different kinds of phone numbers, that kind of stuff that's going to be really helpful for you. I guess before we move on, is there anything else that anyone notices here that they would like to point out? I know we don't do a lot of audience participation in class, but is there anything that people want to point out here that didn't catch? Yeah, all the profile photos have the same portrait and background kind of style. That's a really good point. A lot of the time, people's photos are not this legible. It's not really this clear about who everyone is. It's a really excellent point. Yeah. Anyone else? Anyone in chat? Okay. Yeah. I would be having a critical eye anytime you see kind of examples like this. Kind of start thinking about it if you ever catch it. If you ever see another person using lorem ipsum on the internet, don't like roast them for it or anything. But make a mental note of it in your head and think about ways that you might be able to improve on that piece of work. Yeah, so knowing how to avoid this means knowing how to do good content-driven design. So how does content-driven design actually work? Good content is based on your users and your users' motivations. So whatever they intend to use this app for, whatever they intend to put kind of information into whatever your design is. Understanding users' needs is really critical, as we kind of drilled on before over and over again, and it's vital to understand the experience that they have going through your designs. There's a lot of UX research tools that can help inform content-driven designs as well, and we'll talk about a few different examples that are going to help you answer these kind of tough questions, like what are you trying to communicate to your audience? What has the user seen before they get to your content? What kind of information do they have going into this screen that would be important in deciding what kind of text to show? And finally, what is the user looking for? What is their goal when they use this design? And how can your design help them efficiently and usefully and effectively find what they actually need? So one method that you can approach answering these questions is card sorting. So this is something you can do with different users. If you have them in the room physically, you can give them a deck of cards with a word or image and ask them to rank them according to a question or a criteria that makes sense to them. So one example of this that I saw recently was having people write out a list of things that you can do, for example, in Figma, and then ask them to categorize those things into beginner, intermediate, and advanced. So a lot of the time you have these kind of obscure or abstract terms like beginner, like advanced, that you want to have a better understanding of. So asking users to do this without you having to bias them is really, really important and really, really helpful. This helps you develop, again, something like an information architecture, which is kind of like a hierarchy or a way to organize information, understand how it relates to each other, that best aligns with the user's expectations and values. So in this example, you've given them these 9 cards and told them to sort them into categories, So this user would have identified 3 categories of academics, tuition, and admissions, and then put different items in underneath all of those categories, which begins to create this architecture of like these levels that these pieces of information exist on. The second method is journey mapping. This is something that you might have heard of before. It's a really big part of things like human-centered design, and we might have mentioned it in the past. So when you do something like journey mapping, the goal is to visualize interactions that shape somebody's experience or in accomplishing a goal. So that name of journey mapping means you want to identify what does the user experience? How do they feel at those different points? What are they thinking? What are they going through? And then with that, identifying points that you want to improve on. So what is that sequence of interactions of different times that you do something, read something, answer something, have to find something that are going to make up that experience? How do users actually find what they're looking for? So this is an example of somebody trying to switch their phone plan, for example. In this case, the line typically indicates emotion, with it being higher meaning positive emotion and lower meaning negative emotion. So here you have these kind of quotes that kind of exemplify what each of these points mean. So somebody is saying, I wonder if I can pay less. So their mood goes up, kind of optimistically. It goes down because they find a bad deal or see something that is like difficult to compare. It does not go up, so they do that kind of research process and then dips down saying, why is this so difficult? This is a really low point in this process where they say, this is really hard for me to do. I'm over it. I'm going to switch providers. And from there it goes up as they go through this process of finding a new phone provider where it's difficult, but it's worth it. At the end, they successfully changed their plan and they're happy with it. So this idea of journey mapping in how it can inform content, it tells you a little bit about what a user is looking for, what a user knows as they're looking for it, and what a user expects at the end of their experience. So knowing that information is going to help you put in content that's very real and content that's going to be actually helpful in helping them make those decisions. And finally, that idea of information architecture that we mentioned, talking about card sorting. So information architecture is a visual representation of our product's infrastructure, features, hierarchy, how everything is going to relate to one another. So a lot of the time in these examples, you're going to see that each of the cards basically corresponds to a single screen. So you've got onboarding screens that tell you how to use the app, which leads you to the welcome screen. From the welcome screen, you have 3 options of different things to do. This middle option where you get to log in with your email leads you to a whole other flow of things here. So by creating something like this, which FigJam is great for, basically you can help organize and plan the content of a website, an app, an experience as you're wireframing or building it. A more like untangible example of something like this would be like a choose your own adventure book. You can think of how it has all these branching moments that you have to understand content that you've read before in order to decide what your decision is going to be. Basically, every kind of app is a tiny choose your own adventure book. You can think through all of those decision pages as anytime you interact with the app, anytime you have to think about, am I going to close this window? Am I going to click continue? Am I going to give it my information? Those are all decisions that the user is making that influence their final choice. Any questions about content-driven design? Okay, awesome. Well, I hope that you do it. I hope that you actually put this into practice and any of the kind of work that you do. Content-driven design is immensely helpful and always going to be beneficial in the real world. So with that, there's another piece of language that we want to talk about today, specifically plain language. So we've talked a little bit about accessibility in week 5. And plain language is a little bit of an overlooked piece of how to make your content more accessible to all users. So plain language is communication that your audience can understand the first time they read or hear it. If you've ever learned design or any kind of academic content, you've probably seen how a lot of language can be super complex. Academic language is always a barrier to accessing information. It can be difficult to understand things because they're written in a way that makes it seem like you have to be really good at this to get what they're saying. We're very anti that. I hate that so much. The Plain Language Initiative thus was grown out of a desire for government work or government communications to be more clear to the public. So government information is one of the places where there's the most jargon, the most legal terminology, the most confusing words that you can possibly find. So I believe there's a government agency that started this initiative for plain language to make universally applicable guidelines that make language more clear. So design accessibility, like we talked about before, often encompasses things like color contrast, like physical interventions, but plain language is a really great example of design accessibility that's good for everybody. It's often overlooked, but it can be helpful for people with reading disabilities, for people with cognitive disabilities, and also people with different first languages, if you're not familiar with English, or if you just don't know about the subject as an expert. It's helpful to literally everyone, so it's something that you should try to practice in your own work. So there's a lot of different things on this checklist, and the best way to learn about it would really just be to access the plainlanguage.gov checklist, but we'll highlight some important things for you here. So a couple things to run through. Plain language has headings that inform what you're going to actually be talking about. So they're useful, they're not just kind of there to be there. Plain language means that your content is actually organized and serves the user needs. So writing content that's super difficult to parse through is in itself inaccessible. Even if you can physically read it, it's difficult to do so. Plain language also often uses the word you and pronouns to speak to the reader, and as opposed to being like this weird third entity that a lot of academic writing requests you to do, where you're like not talking about yourself and you're not talking to the reader. It's just like omnipotent existence. That can be really difficult to digest and understand, especially as a non-English speaker. So using you and having the content talk to you is really, really helpful. A lot of it is also about being really concise. So use short sections, use short sentences, omit excess words, do anything that you can to make the content as readable and skimmable as possible. Use concrete and familiar words. So do things like relating to physical objects instead of relating to abstract concepts. Don't use really long, complicated words like hegemony or whatever. I don't even know what hegemony means. Don't use that. And then finally, a really interesting thing is to use lists and tables to simplify complex material. If you asked a room full of people if they would better understand like something visual versus something that's just text, a lot of them are going to say visual because our brains just kind of process that information better. So using things like lists and tables is going to help you understand something that can be pretty complicated a lot more quickly. Plain language of the web is also a really great example of that. So here, you have this really dense paragraph that is shortened into 6 pieces on a table that tells you how you want to do something really quickly. And a part of this is because on the web, on the internet, people don't want to read shit. Like they want to look at something and then be able to have their answer in like 5 or 6 seconds. They want to be able to skim it immediately. So another couple of examples that are specific to web content. Never use the words click here as a link. I'm guilty of this. I do this a lot in Slack messages. I'm trying to work on it as well. Link language should describe what your reader's going to get if they do actually click the link, like open the calendar through this link or something like that, which actually tells you where you're going to end up. Make liberal use of white space so pages are easy to scan. You don't need to make your content super packed. Having white space gives you breathing room, gives your eyes room to move around and understand the content that you're looking at. Write using the same words that your readers would use when doing a web search. So sometimes there's going to be really specific terms that you have to use, but in other situations you can do things like using words that just make more sense to people. So eliminate jargon when you can and use words that make sense. And finally, a little bit more broadly, don't assume that your readers have knowledge of a subject or have read other pages on the internet. Assume that people are beginners and clearly explain things so that a page can stand on its own without you having to access a bunch of other content or access a bunch of different tutorials to understand it. Yeah, any questions about plain language? Okay, awesome. I think another like really easy way to digest what this means is like explain it like a 6-year-old will understand it. I think it's a principle that I use a lot of the time. I think it's a really great thing to do. One, because it's important to value honestly what children think about things. You know, actually try explaining things to a 6-year-old and see how they react. And it's probably going to be different from how your peers are going to react. But also that piece of just language being important. Not everybody has like super academic reading experience. Not everybody's had to do all of these papers. it can just be difficult to understand things if you speak to them like they're already an expert. So speak to them like they don't know anything about the topic if they actually don't know anything about the topic. Be appropriate whenever you're communicating with somebody. But yeah, I'm gonna drink some water. But we're gonna talk next about Figma plugins. So we talked about this last week. Today we're just gonna kind of talk about some other cool plugins and ways that you can use them to supercharge your experience. Okay, so Figma plugins. We again discussed this last week. Plugins kind of serve as little power-ups and they help you extend Figma's product functionality. So they can help with things like automating tasks, filling in real content like we just talked about, checking accessibility, and more. Lots of fun things exist on the plugin side as well, and a lot of practical tools that users can crowdsource. So a really great thing about plugins that we've mentioned is how they're used and created by Figma community members. So it is people like you who have identified something that they're struggling with, who have identified something that in their workflow is really complicated, and they've just gone out of their way to make it free for everyone to use on the internet. You can also build your own plugins. If you know any CS, if you're interested in learning how to code, I cannot help you, but people on the internet can. And building a plugin is a really cool way to both contribute to community and build something that you actually need and can power up your workflow. So Annie has kind of categorized plugins into a couple of different categories. First is utility plugins. These are really practical things that help you speed up the process of working. So a lot of this might be things that you have wished you could do, but you can't right now. So an example is one we talked about last week, Better Font Picker, to let you select fonts and preview how they look. Rename It lets you batch rename layers and frames. It's actually, I think, a slightly little known fact that you can also have a lot of flexibility in renaming layers in a batch if you just select multiple and rename them. That's something you can do right now as well, but the plugin gives you a lot more flexibility with it. Find and replace. This is something that doesn't exist in Figma, like Control F. You can't really do that with your text and find all the different things that you need, but Find and Replace lets you do that. And a couple others like Clean Document, which is going to clean up your file, Similayer, which lets you select all with a different range of properties, and Red Lines, which helps you annotate pixel dimensions and measurements. And something to note here is that a lot of these are building on existing Figma features, and also some of them might actually end up becoming features in the future, becoming things that people use so often that there's a reason to include it into your workflow. The example is like with Rename It and Similayer, you actually can do the select all with thing. I'll show you how to do that just because it took me a long time to learn how to do this. Figma has a quick search menu. If you press Control and / the one that's with the question mark on your canvas, it's going to pull up this menu. If you type in select, you can do things like select all text layers. That's going to help you really quickly grab everything you need in a file. So that's an extra shortcut for you today. So next category is accessibility plugins. These are really awesome. I would really recommend downloading a couple of these or all of them and incorporating them regularly into your workflow. A really easy one to understand is Able, which just checks color contrast ratios to meet, I think it's like 4.51 or something like that. That's under the WCAG standards of being high enough color contrast to be readable to all people. Focus Order is a little bit more interesting. It helps you decide or annotate designs for people who use keyboard navigation or screen readers, where it tells you what order things are going to be selected if you were to like tab across the screen or navigate across the screen without a mouse. Colorblind lets you view your designs with different types of color vision deficiencies. And finally, Viewports previews designs on a bunch of different device sizes to make sure that they're responsive. This is, again, especially helpful if you're designing in a situation where you're, say, for example, not going to have a lot of iPhone users. A lot of the iPhone designs that you see are really optimized for iPhones, but they either do not work on Android or look really bad on Android. So doing something like using viewports and looking at older phones is really helpful to make sure that your work is always going to be useful and accessible to anybody. Content plugins. So we talked about having content-driven design, having useful and real content, super helpful. Annie's a big proponent of this Google Sheets sync. This is actually the week 7 homework. which she did an example of, and she actually used the Google Sheets Sync plugin to add all of the information super easily so that she could go back and mess with it later on in the future. She also used this for her resume and is a big proponent of making Figma in your resume because you can really, really easily update all the information in Google Sheets and then have it synced up so that it updates automatically. Content Reel helps you insert text-based content into your designs that is not lorem ipsum. Mapsicle lets you add map images without having to take screenshots of maps all the time. And then Chart makes charts. I don't know what to tell you there, but you can use real or randomized data to create customized charts that match your designs, and you can have kind of mock data for anything that you want to do without having to guess numbers. Blush has a lot of free modular illustrations by this artist Pablo Stanley. If you ever need illustrations in your apps without having to just like make up your own design system, Blush has a lot of them. Then Unsplash has stock photos for you to use. I'm not gonna say that you always have to like take your own photos for anything, but if you ever use stock photos or anything, make sure that you're looking at photos that would be relevant to the content that you have and not gradients. Yeah. Finally, some fun stuff. The timer turns any text into a countdown timer by modifying the text box. Blobs make these blobs, which are kind of hard to make look good when you're just making them on your own. So if you never need them for design, you can grab that plugin. Figmotion is a plugin that we talked about, I think, briefly last week, where you can create animations in Figma. Pattern here helps you make patterns, and then Figma Community, or Figma Tetris, sorry, was made by Emily Zong, who was like a friend of ours, and she made Tetris completely playable in Figma, because that's a thing that you can do. And then also, there's a lot more on Figma Community. In addition to that, there's a lot more things that have recently been released that I'll talk through in a second. But yeah, in order to find and install plugins, just go to Community, look through the file browser, or look through the plugins tab that's pinned at the top, or search through different kinds of plugins. You can click Install to add the plugin to your Figma account, which means that when you're using any kind of files on that account, you're going to be able to access that particular plugin. If you want to use it, all you have to do is right-click anywhere in the canvas, select Plugins in the menu, and then it'll drop down this whole list of other plugins that you have. I think if you're on a Mac, you can also use the top bar. There should be an option for plugins, but this should be universal as well. So a few things that you need to know are that you have to run a plugin manually. If you ever close and open a file, a plugin will not stay running. You have to always make sure that you're running it whenever you want to use it. And they also can't do anything in the background. You have to be focused on it and use it. Once you click away, you're not going to have it open anymore. But yeah, another thing is that FigJam literally today released a huge update that lets you have plugins in FigJam as well. And also a new kind of item called widgets, which are kind of like interactive additions to your FigJam board. So things like the timer, things like dice and polls that kind of make the experience a little bit more fun and interactive. And the special thing about those is that plugins are going to work for you personally, but widgets are going to be interactive and multiplayer where you can have multiple people interact with them at the same time. So yeah, really quick, I'll walk through again how to find plugins on Community. You can access Community through here. You're going to see these sections. It's actually highlighting plugins right now. So you can click here and find a ton of different plugins here. All you have to do is install one. I'm going to go ahead and install Blobs. It is now done installing. It took all of 2 seconds. And then I can right click, go to plugins, and select Blobs. Let's make a blob of complexity 5 and contrast 3. And make. It's going to take a second to load in, which you can expect. Another unique thing about plugins is that a lot of the time they're going to have their own UI. So I can see that they have made them here. Yeah. Let me drag these out. And now I've just got these blobs that have been automatically made for me, and you can treat them like any other vector. So I can go ahead and change the color of them, make them look nicer. And I can just interact with them like a normal shape on my canvas. So basically, we really hope that you do play with these plugins and learn things that are interesting to you. There's a lot of examples of stuff that, for example, was popular in Adobe Illustrator, but you don't have in Figma. People have just gone ahead and built stuff for that. So like Image Tracer is really useful if you want to grab an icon from the internet and use it for yourself. We can look up that one really fast. Image tracer lets you use bitmap images really quickly. Arc lets you have your text in an arc, which you can't do by default. I don't know. Here it is, yeah. It lets you curve your text upward, downward, whatever you need. And yeah, there's like thousands and thousands of plugins that you should look into. I know some people use a ton of them. I don't use a lot all the time, but I really should be. But yeah, go ahead and do your own exploration into what kind of plugins you find helpful. But any questions about those before we kind of wrap up for today? Awesome. Well, this week we're unfortunately going back to having homework for just a couple of weeks. Oh, it's 8:15 and everything breaks. I thought it was 8:20. That's okay. I'm gonna go ahead and keep talking. I think a lot of you had the slides up, but if you don't, we're just talking about the announcements now. Homework is the auto layout menu that I talked about earlier, where you're gonna have a restaurant menu that you create from scratch using different components that have auto layout properties on them. So you can think of like every dish needs to be organized really nicely. You can make components that have like the dish name, the dish price and description, and have them resized really easily. Please do not hesitate to come to office hours. We know this is a pretty tricky concept and we're more than happy to help you. And also honestly, like learn with you as you go and just practice things. Lab 7, again, is the Flexbox Froggy thing I showed you earlier. Flexbox is a CSS property, so it's something that you see a lot if you're coding. And the reason why auto layout can be really helpful is it helps you parallel things that you'd have to code. So Flexbox is a really big example of how you make your designs coded responsibly. So Flexbox Froggy is actually a game that exists on the web that Annie made a version of to practice auto layout, and it's a great way to get your feet wet, pun intended, with auto layout. So it'll help you kind of visualize how different changes are going to look when you actually need to apply them. The secret word for today is going to be, I never think of this. Any words? Frog, F-R-O-G. The secret word today is frog, F-R-O-G. And announcements, just remember that you have homework this week. Even if you go to midterm extension, that's not necessarily going to translate to a homework extension, so just keep that in mind and use your time wisely. Please do play with the new FigJam updates. They're awesome. They're super fun. I don't know if your TAs might do them in lab, but feel free to play with them on your own. And about the midterm deadline, tonight is your last day to submit if you're using your slip day. So again, it was due last night. If you submit by midnight tonight, you'll use your slip day or you'll be using it on the final or whatever. So you'll have no penalty. If you haven't already reached out to us about an extension, please do like immediately. We are more than happy to help you with things and we want to be like kind to you. We don't want to have to subtract points from anybody. So please just do make sure to let us know if anything has come up. I know that this midterm season has been pretty hell for a lot of people. So just let us know as soon as possible. I'll be responding to messages later tonight and as soon as we can. But that's all for this week. Thank you so much, and I will see you next week to talk about advanced prototyping. All right, bye-bye.